What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. I'm joined by your favorite beat reporter, Chris Fedor, and we just got done with the NBA Finals Game 1. Dallas Mavericks, Boston Celtics. We don't want to get too deep into this conversation, but Chris, I just want to get your immediate takeaways from Game 1 and what you thought about the NBA Finals experience for the first game of the series.
Well, Boston's really, really good. And I think sometimes as a playoff run goes on and on and on, and there's this other team that kind of pops up the way that Dallas has with what Luka and Kyrie have been able to do that was more surprising, right? Not a lot of people expected the Mavericks to be in the NBA Finals. So you got caught up in the hoopla of all of that and the gaudy numbers that Kyrie and Luka were putting up together and the way that the Mavericks played in the Western Conference playoffs. And I feel like people got swept up in the emotions of all of that and overlooked the fact that Boston has been the best team in the NBA all season long. They won 64 games for a reason, and they were getting Kristaps Porzingis back from an injury. So they got to the NBA Finals essentially without Kristaps Porzingis, a very, very important player at both ends of the floor for the Celtics. And now he's back. And if he can be healthy and effective, we've all seen just the level that Boston can get to. So Dallas hasn't seen a team like Boston. Minnesota can't do the things defensively that Boston can do. Minnesota can't do the things offensively that Boston can do. And you can go down the list of the other teams that Dallas played against in the Western Conference playoffs, and you can say they aren't Boston. So I think too many people lost sight of the fact of just how dominant the Celtics have been all season long, and how impressive their playoff run was because it happened without one of their most important players, and they still basically cruised into the NBA Finals. So one game does not a final series make. Game 1, the Celtics winning and the Celtics dominating, it doesn't mean that that's going to be the remainder of this series. Dallas is going to make adjustments. Dallas is going to change some things offensively and defensively. Variance is going to play a part in this thing, just like it always does. But Boston showed tonight they didn't even need Jason Tatum to be great to win the game. Boston showed tonight just how deep, formidable, and just how good they are at both ends of the floor.
Yeah, Chris, and we talked about it beforehand. Kristaps Porzingis being added to this lineup is a cheat code, first and foremost. And two, I made the notion that I think that if the Boston Celtics want this team to get to where it wants, that Jaylen Brown has to continue to be one of the best players, if not the best player on the floor for the Celtics. And he was like that tonight. He did what he needed to do on both ends of the floor. He was aggressive on the defensive end. He came away with a couple of blocks, and then he put up over 20 points. So you know what he needs to do. And you, like you mentioned, Jason Tatum wasn't on his A game, still contributed. They had a multiple of players that were in double figures, and that's what the Celtics need to be successful, because we know how spread their offensive success can be. But Chris, this is not about the NBA Finals. This is not about the Celtics or the Mavericks. This is a Cavs podcast. So, of course, we have to talk about the NBA Finals because that's what's hot right now. But I do want to get into another topic that is going to weigh on the Cavs heavily this offseason, and that comes back to another exit interview that we've been doing, a kind of a series, and this is the one for Isaac Okoro. Isaac has grown as an offensive player this season. He's continued to grow in his career. We know how good he is on the defensive end for the Cavs, especially when it comes from being in as a point of attack defender and what that means for the Cavs. But also, he was able to raise his three-point percentage from 36.3% last season all the way up to 39.1% this season on more attempts than he's had since his rookie season. That was 3.1 average 3-point 3-point attempts for this year, and he also had 9.4 average points per game while shooting 49% from the floor. So, as much as people wanted to second guess and question Isaac Okoro's offensive ability, and I think it's warranted because he was hit or miss, and I think you have to look at what he's been able to do for his entire career and how that has grown and the work that we've gotten to see behind the scenes of Isaac putting in to get to where he is today. So I wanted to get your overview of Isaac Okoro's season and what you think needs to happen for this offseason for the Cavs for Isaac to continue to grow as an organization.
Well, first of all, there's no guarantee that Isaac's going to be back. I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to him. He is headed toward restricted free agency, and he has a new agent. This is a complicated discussion that the Cavs are about to enter into. Just like the contract discussions that the Cavs had last offseason with Isaac, they were complicated because it's hard to pinpoint what his true value is. And it's hard to put a financial number on that value because there are things that he does well. And there's no doubt that he's an impactful defensive player. He's a guy who in the future is probably going to make a couple of all defensive teams. He's tough. He's physical. He's really, really good at the point of attack. He makes a lot of these guys work for quality offense on a consistent basis. He's a good cutter. He's a good finisher in transition. The problem is the skill that continues to be missing for Isaac is that consistent, reliable outside shot. And you mentioned his shooting percentages, and it's true. He has gotten better as a three-point shooter, but teams don't believe in him as a three-point shooter. And that's what it comes down to. We've talked about this so many times on this podcast. I've written about this so many times for cleveland.com, Ethan, that gravity is not a product of percentage. Gravity is a product of volume. And if you're a high volume three-point shooter that threatens a defense in a different kind of way, then you bring more value to the table, right? But if you're a low volume three-point shooter with a quality percentage, if a defense is not going to guard you, and a majority of those looks are going to be wide open looks because a defense just doesn't respect you, that restricts the offense. And toward the end of the series against Boston, he was once again almost unplayable. So there are legitimate questions about whether Isaac can be playable in a 7-game playoff series, or how playable he can be in a 7-game playoff series. And look, the Cavs are at a point right now when it comes to their evaluation of this roster and just their construction of this roster, where they've got to start thinking about that. We talked about George Niang on the previous podcast about being an 82-game player as opposed to a 16-game player. They're chasing championships now. If Donovan Mitchell is going to re-sign long-term here, it's with the idea that the Cavs are going to compete for conference finals appearances and NBA finals appearances. And you need guys that can help you significantly in a playoff environment. You need to commit to guys financially that can help you in a playoff environment. And if Isaac Okoro is going to be a guy where you're like, maybe he can, maybe he can't, do we have to go away from him in certain series? Then it's hard to sit here and say, yeah, we're going to give him $12 to $15 million a year, or we're going to give him $15 to $18 million a year. So I do think this is a complicated conversation between the Cavs and Isaac's new reps, because it's hard to put a value on who he is as a player and who he will be in the future as a player.
Yeah, Chris, and I mean, you mentioned his playoff woes, and I want to go to his stats in the playoffs and look at the drop-off in his three-point percentage. We
Look at the
talked about
minutes, too.
Yeah, the minutes as well. 21.9 average per game over 12 games and 7 starts. This season, he's played in 17 total playoff games, 9 starts in those appearances. But like we said, for this past season, he was around 39% from three-point range in the regular season. Those numbers dropped all the way down to 25.7 in the playoffs. And like we said, he was around 9 points per game in the regular season, and he's down to 5.5 in the postseason. So we understand, and we've talked about it on multiple occasions. The defensive aspect that Isaac Okoro brings to the table cannot go unsaid. And that's the same thing when it comes to Dean Wade. But the difference between the conversation we had about Dean Wade is that he has not been as available or healthy or 100% and ready to go in these playoff appearances that he's had over the last 2 seasons. So you don't know 100% what he would have given you. In this sense with Isaac Okoro, you have the understanding that he's been healthy, he's been available, and yet time and time again in the playoffs, he hasn't reached the pinnacle of his abilities that the Cavs needed him to play at for them to be successful and to make it further into the rounds that they wanted to. So I think the question then goes to next, Chris, is do the Cavs have somebody on their roster or in their sights that can immediately do the same things that Isaac Okoro can do and add some in the playoffs when they're needed most?
Here's the thing, Ethan, and I don't want this to come across as me bashing Isaac or being totally negative to Isaac. I just think the thing that he does best, the trait that makes him potentially special on the defensive end of the floor, it's easier to find that. Like, that is not at a premium in today's NBA. And it doesn't mean that like all these guys that I would hypothetically mention will be the same caliber defender as Isaac. But are they good enough at that end of the floor? Can they hold their own at that end of the floor? Can they bring a level of toughness, a level of tenacity, a level of competitiveness on that end of the floor? Like, that's what matters most. And I just think like finding that kind of player profile is a lot easier, especially because he just does not have a reliable outside shot attached to that. So I don't think he would be that hard to replace. And it doesn't mean that the Cavs are going to move on from him. Look, if the only thing that he's going to get offered on the marketplace is the mid-level exception, I think that becomes an easy match for the Cavs. I don't think being a restricted free agent, it makes it a little bit complicated to begin with. Restricted free agency, the guys that end up going elsewhere in restricted free agency, the list of those guys is very, very short. And I don't think anybody out there is sitting there saying, we've got to prioritize Isaac Okoro. We've got to tie up some of our salary on Isaac Okoro specifically. You know what I mean? Because even though there are strengths that he has, the flaws are pretty problematic. And the teams that have money that are playoff level teams are going to be asking the same questions about his viability in those situations. And they're going to be asking about whether it's worth it to commit financially to a guy who, you know, probably can't play 25 to 30 minutes in a playoff series, at least per game. So then you start looking at some other teams that do have money to spend this offseason, and you ask yourself, like, is Detroit going to open up the checkbook for Isaac? Is Washington going to? Are the San Antonio Spurs going to? Like, what team out there is really lurking that is a threat to take Isaac away from the Cavs, that is a threat to give him a big financial offer that the Cavs would be queasy to match? And I just don't see that team out there. Look, the Cavs have done a ton of their research on this. They've talked to so many people around the NBA to try and get some kind of gauge of Isaac's value. They have their own value that they've placed on Isaac from a financial standpoint. And I think the teams that come to mind are like Toronto, Charlotte, potentially Detroit, like I said, San Antonio, like I said. But I just don't know that any of those teams are going to commit significant money to him that the Cavs wouldn't be willing to match. So restricted free agency helps the Cavs here. It gives them a lot of leverage. They're going to use it this offseason. They've used it in the past with a lot of these different guys. And I do think that there is a strong chance that Isaac is back with the Cavs, because I just don't think there's an offer out there that's waiting for him that the Cavs wouldn't be willing to match.
And I think you mentioned a key point when it comes to his defense and the opportunity for guys to match that, because you look at the disadvantageous situations that the Cavs put him in this playoff series and the guys that he was tasked with guarding. There are guys like, if you look at NBA.com for matchup data,
Hmm.
he guarded Paolo Banchero for 25 minutes, Jaylen Brown for 23 minutes, and
Yeah.
then Franz Wagner and Cole Anthony for nearly 10 minutes plus. Those are the four guys that he guarded the most over the time that he was in the playoffs this past
Hmm.
series. He held Paolo Banchero to 50% from the floor, 13 of 26. He committed 5 turnovers in the 25 minutes in over 7 games, I need to say, against Isaac Okoro. And then you look at Jaylen Brown. Jaylen Brown was 9 of 13 for 69.2%. He committed just 2 turnovers. And we've talked about the run that Jaylen Brown has had this postseason. And like, these are two of the primary guys that they have faced. Isaac
Yeah.
Okoro has taken to task players that are at the next level. Like, they're at the height of their career, are getting there. And it's a tough task to ask of anybody, but much less somebody who's not only undersized, but has to go up against players that have other guys to give to, especially when you're talking about Jaylen Brown and the Boston Celtics. Franz Wagner is a different story. He was just 2 of 6 in the 11 minutes over 7 games that he played against Isaac Okoro as the primary defender. And Cole Anthony was 2 of 7 over the 10 minutes in 6 games that Isaac Okoro was the primary
Hmm.
defender that guarded him. So you look at those guys that are closer in stature, closer in size when it comes to Isaac Okoro. Obviously, Franz Wagner is bigger than Isaac, but he's not that much burlier. So I think you got to also take into account the amount of stress that Isaac's been under, and especially we talk about what he's had to deal with since he got in his rookie year. JB Bickerstaff was not one to shy away from it, saying that they basically threw him into the
Right.
fire and let him learn that way. And sure, that has been great for Isaac when it comes to that, but he's also prioritized and taken pride in the defensive aspect of the ball. Sure, he's worked on his offensive game, but when it comes to the playoffs and you need somebody to lock down guys that you know are tough scorers, that's what Isaac's focusing on. Much
Right.
less about making shots and creating looks for himself, but just being out there and creating space. And sometimes that doesn't cut it when it comes to the playoffs. So, Chris, I just want to get more into the restricted free agency part of it, because this is a guy that could be on the market, could not be picked up by any other team. What does that do for the mentality of a guy knowing that for the last 2 years you've been on the chopping block but still end up with the same team?
I don't know that he's been on the chopping block per se. I just think it's the reality of the NBA, and I think it's the situation that he's in with his contract. I also think that, at the time that the Cavs drafted Isaac, it was the idea that, we're pretty far away. We're going to take a high upside swing. We understand that he's raw offensively. We understand that there are weaknesses that he has on that end of the floor, but those things can be corrected. So we're going to take the time. We're going to do the work behind the scenes. We're going to develop him. Right? That was the plan for Isaac. That's why they used the 5th overall pick on him. But in a way, the Cavs outgrew Isaac. They grew faster, they developed, they evolved quicker than Isaac was ready to, because they made that blockbuster trade for Donovan Mitchell that accelerated their timeline, that changed the expectations, that changed what the goals were for this organization. So no longer was it so much about player development. No longer was it so much about we're going to learn on the fly. We're going to play this guy 30 to 35 minutes a night, let him play through his mistakes and all that kinds of stuff, like in meaningful game situations. that changed. All of a sudden, the Cavs, it was more about chasing wins, getting to the playoffs, getting past the first round of the playoffs. And if development took a back seat to that, on-court meaningful development in game situations took a back seat to that, then so be it. So I just think the situation around Isaac changed significantly. And now he's looking at an offseason where, people around the NBA, just like the Cavs, are trying to figure out what is the true value for this guy. Because you were talking about his defense, and look, I'm not going to dismiss his defense. His defense is great. We've brought up this website that I use a lot, Dunks and Threes. They use estimated plus minus, defensive estimated plus minus. And Isaac Okoro was in basically right around the 90th percentile. But here's the thing, Ethan. When it comes to free agency in the NBA, defense first guys don't get paid. They don't get paid big money. You know who gets paid big money in today's NBA with the style? Shooters. Even if they're weak on defense, even if they feel like, hey, when you get into a 7-game series, you might get played off the floor or something like that. Shooters get paid in today's NBA. Think about this. Duncan Robinson makes $18 million a year. Tim Hardaway Jr. makes $18 million a year. Davis Bertans makes $17 million a year. PJ Washington, $17 million per year. Kevin Huerter, $16 million per year. Luke Kennard, $15 million per year. Those guys get paid because they can shoot, because they can space the floor, because they contain a level of gravity on the offensive end that can make whatever offense it is have a higher ceiling because of the attention that they command everywhere they go. Max Strus, $15 million a year. Doug McDermott, who can't play a lick of defense at all, makes $14 million a year. Now, you can sit there and you can say those are bad deals. You can sit there and you can say that whatever team it was that signed those guys, they overpaid in a significant way. Probably right in a lot of those cases. But teams are going to overspend on shooting. They're going to overspend on offense. They're not going to overspend on a defense-first player that still doesn't have a reliable perimeter jumper. And one more thing. We talked about the playoffs. And this just goes to show what the Orlando Magic and the Boston Celtics thought about Isaac Okoro. So he took 35 three-pointers in the playoff series combined against Orlando and Boston. Do you know how many of those were contested?
I'd have to say 0.
One. One was considered very tight or tight. 34 were considered open or wide open. That just restricts your offense when you have a guy who's sitting out there on the perimeter that the defense isn't going to guard. That extra defender is crashing to take away the paint on drives against Darius Garland or Donovan Mitchell. Or they're tagging Jared Allen or Evan Mobley on the roll. Or they're coming over from the weak side to help out in the paint, or whatever the case may be. That extra defender is being occupied in a different kind of way if a reliable, threatening shooter is out there. And that's something that every team is going to consider. And that's why, limited offensive players have a hard time getting big-time free agency money. And I think Isaac is in the same kind of situation. And I think his range is probably going to be somewhere between $12 and $15 million. And the guy that comes to mind for me is Herb Jones of the New Orleans Pelicans. His deal was about $12 million annually. If he's getting about $12 million annually, how would the Cavs or any other team in the NBA justify giving Isaac more than that? So I think he's just in a situation right now where the thing that he does best is not valued as highly, and the thing that he does worst at this point in his career is the thing that all NBA teams want. And if that thing that you do worst is something that teams around the NBA still wonder about at this stage of your career and your development, it's hard to, it's hard to commit to that financially.
And I know we mentioned the NBA Finals earlier, and we talked a little bit about Jaylen Brown, and he was one of those guys that signed a $300+ million 5-year supermax extension contract. And you think about the questioning that he got from
Right.
not the organization, but from outside, and thinking about, especially after the series where people were questioning his left hand and things of that nature. But now he's showing you in this year's NBA Finals, or so far after game one, that he can create on his own, and he's also going to give you the defense that I think when he was coming into the league, he was better known for than he was his scoring. So, I mean, I think it's just interesting to think about. And Herb Jones is a great example because he was one of the guys that everybody talked about when it came to defense. And Isaac Okoro didn't make a defensive team, and yet Herb Jones was in that conversation. And you think about what Isaac is going to continue to bring for the Cavs. Sure, we see it on a daily basis, the intangibles, how hard he works, the amount of effort he puts in. But if that doesn't cause results, at the end of the day, that can only get you so far. And that's
Yep.
the hard truth of the NBA. And I think that's what Chris was getting to earlier. Like, you can only do so much to help your cause. And
Right.
if teams can find reason to go get somebody else that can do what you do even a little bit better for a cheaper price, they're going to go do that without a second of hesitation.
Look, the Cavs like Isaac. They've invested in Isaac. They used the 5th overall pick on him. They've been committed to developing him behind the scenes. They've obviously reconfigured his entire shooting stroke. He's only 23 years old. There's probably aspects of his offense that, some team or the Cavs can probably tap into more and more as this career goes on. You can probably say that there is more potential for him to become a better offensive player. Like I said, he's a good cutter, he's a good finisher in transition, but he has absolutely no mid-range game, none to speak of. And opponents don't guard him out on the perimeter when he's spotted up for 3-point. That can be problematic. That's tough to work around. When you're talking about game plans and putting in an offensive game plan, and you're talking about a potential playoff series where it's all about masking strengths and preying on weaknesses, like that is a clear weakness that opponents are going to repeatedly prey on. That's what the Magic did. That's what the Boston Celtics did. That's what every smart team would do. Like if you see a weak point, if you see something within a player's offensive game that you feel like you can exploit, then you can continue to do it. He's also not somebody who's going to take advantage of mismatches. Like if there's a switch and there's a smaller guy on him, does he have enough polish on the offensive end of the floor to take advantage of that? Can he go in the post and bully a smaller player? He hasn't shown that, right? Or if he gets like a slower footed guy defending him on the perimeter, can he take advantage of that matchup by taking that guy off the dribble consistently and finishing at the rim? There's just, when it comes to his offensive game, there are just so many different holes in it. And I think, even if he comes back this year for the Cavs, if they re-sign him in restricted free agency, he's probably going to be a guy who comes off the bench in an energy role, change up the defense, bring a little bit of physicality. Like it's just hard for me or anybody, I think, around the NBA to look at him as a capable starter quality two-way wing with the holes that he has currently in his offensive game. If we're talking about 2-3 years down the road and he becomes like the prototypical 3-and-D guy because that 3-point shot becomes more reliable and he continues to add to his offensive game, all right, that changes the equation. That changes the math. That changes the kind of role that he could potentially have. But at this stage, yes, part of it is the Cavs are negotiating with Isaac about what Isaac will be eventually, but it's also about what they have seen him be. And how they project that moving forward based on the evidence in front of them. And I just think all of that together makes it a very difficult conversation. And I think that's why it was so difficult last year when it came to the negotiations. Um, like I said, I don't think there's a team out there that is a threat to take Isaac away. Maybe Orlando. Maybe Orlando. That's not a team that we mentioned. If JB Bickerstaff goes as an assistant on the staff of Jamal Mosley, um, on a team that obviously focuses on defense and has built its core on the defensive end of the floor, Isaac makes a lot of sense for a team like that in Orlando. But I just don't see a situation that would make the Cavs nervous when it comes to Isaac in his free agency. And I think they're going to be able to re-sign him at a fair, team-friendly contract that allows him to play the role that he should play at this stage of his career and get the kind of minutes that he probably should get at this stage of his career. But he's not a core member of the team. We're talking about probably like the 7th, 8th, 9th guy in a championship level rotation. That's who he is right now, and it's going to be up to him as his career continues to keep putting in that work that he does, because he's a relentless worker, and show maybe one day that he can be more than that.
And Chris, usually during these exit interviews that we do for each player, we get into the best game of the season for this guy, and I'm stuck between 3 different games at the moment.
Okay.
And 2 of these games, it's hard for me to pick because they ended in losses. So I'm privy to change to the third option that I have, but I want to give you the first 2 options. First 2 options, the first one was against Atlanta when they lost on March 6th, after the back-to-back, after they came back against the Boston Celtics. That was just a tough game, but he had 17 points. He was able to shoot 7 of 13 from the floor. And obviously, like I said in the last podcast, I love it when players can go home or to places where they have been or spent time and show out and do things, especially in front of family, which I believe Isaac had in attendance at that Atlanta game. And then you think about the second option where they lost was when they played the New York Knicks on March 3rd. And Isaac had 17 points again on 7 of 13 shooting. But he had he was 3 of 8 from 3-point range in that game. He had 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 1 block, and 2 steals. And that feels like the game for me that Isaac generally, that's the game that you think of when you think of Isaac Okoro. He's making his impact on the defensive end, getting in the passing lanes, making sure things are difficult in transition. And then the last game that makes me think is when he had 16 against the Chicago Bulls on February 14th. He was 4 of 8 from 3, 6 of 11 from the floor, but he had just 1 rebound, 2 assists, and nothing to show on the defensive end in the stat sheet, even though we know we cannot always look at the stat sheet for defensive effort. So I want to get your thoughts on what would be your pick for Isaac's best game of the season. And let's keep it to the regular season, because I think we all know which one we would pick in the playoffs. But just let me know what you're thinking about his ability in the regular season, but also what game you were thinking about, and if it falls into one of these 3.
No, it's none of those 3, actually. The one that I look at, and I don't think it's just one, I think it's every Milwaukee game. Every Milwaukee game, he had Damian Lillard in hell. That's the thing. That's what makes you potentially excited about Isaac if you're a team like the Cavs, or if you're a team out there like Orlando or Toronto or Detroit or somebody else that may be considering the possibility of giving him some kind of offer in free agency. An ability to just make that caliber player look so uncomfortable, look so out of rhythm, and the effect that that has on the remainder of the offense. So I think because I just want to pick one, um, he did so well against Milwaukee and Dame in basically every single one of the matchups. But the one that stands out to me is the second road game in Milwaukee because I was sitting up in press row and I was sitting next to a couple of Milwaukee beat reporters, and they're like, Dame is Dame is having an awful game. Like Dame looks completely out of rhythm. Like they were just making all these comments about how bad Dame looked, and they were like, "Who is this Isaac Okoro guy that is shutting him down completely? That has him in a stranglehold?" Because Isaac's not a household name per se, and you know, you don't really look at him the same kind of way that you do Alex Caruso, OG Anunoby, Jalen Suggs, even. Like, he hasn't built that kind of reputation yet. Like, unless you're a diehard basketball fan or a basketball nerd that really digs into the deeper analytics and the impact numbers, Isaac's not really one of those guys that you think about, first and foremost. You know what I mean? So there were these Milwaukee writers that were up there and they were just hammering Dame because he was playing so poorly and he was taking these horrible shots and he couldn't do anything on the offensive end. He couldn't create separation. He couldn't finish at the rim. Like, Isaac had him in a torture chamber that night. And I just remember like turning to them and I'm like, guys, Isaac's a pretty good defender here. I know that you probably don't know of him all that well, but this is a premier defender. This is probably the Cavs' best perimeter defender, and a guy who maybe will get some love for the all defensive team this year. And they're like, really? Well, Dame should be better anyway. So, like, the Milwaukee guys were so frustrated with the way that Dame was playing because Isaac had him in hell on the defensive end of the floor. And that game stands out to me. And that just like shows the kind of impact, even with the limitations offensively, even with the weaknesses on the offensive end of the floor. Um, it shows the kind of impact that he can make as an elite on-ball defender that can just disrupt an offense completely by taking away or making things so difficult on the opponent's best perimeter offensive player.
Chris, I think that's a great tidbit because I just pulled up the stats for Isaac Okoro regular season defense, and obviously he had the most time guarding Damian Lillard for the entire season. It was around 24 minutes, and he held Damian Lillard to 26.5% from the floor, 9 of 34 from the field, and 3 of 17.6% from the 3-point line for a guy that is known for his 3-point shot incapability. Isaac forced 4 turnovers and he had 3 blocks. So you think about somebody that can impact the game defensively. We talk about him being a point of attack defender. I mean, yeah, that if I had to point to a guy that he put into the worst possible situation offensively, it definitely would have been Damian Lillard for this season. So, Chris, I want to open it up to you really quickly and just see if there's anything else you wanted to touch on when it came to Isaac Okoro and going into this next season, and what could be possible for this offseason.
No, I want to ask you, what do you think his value is? Like, if you're the Cavs, if you're in charge of trying to figure out like the next contract for Isaac, how much annually are you comfortable giving him?
I think that's a really good question because annually is hard. If we're thinking like I think he falls in that, because I remember earlier in the season I think we had him up to maybe 18.
15 to 18.
Yeah, 15 to 18. I think it's got to be around that 16 mark because of what happened this playoff series and what we saw from him, because obviously the conversation we had earlier was when it was lower. I don't want to give it so he goes so much lower, like 12
Mm-hmm.
to 14, but I do think 16 would be the right number for Isaac. And I wouldn't go away from saying that the Cavs could put him as a secondary trade piece that could entice some teams, like pairing him with, if the Cavs decide to go away from Jarrett Allen, pairing him with Jarrett and saying, here, we're going to give you a defensive identity in a trade, basically.
Yeah.
That's basically the main one I would think of because of Jarrett's contract situation and things of that nature. But I still think Isaac has some value. I think he, like we mentioned, can put some offensive players into torture chambers. But I think you have to be realistic of what you're going to get in the playoffs and how much you're going to want to use him, because we saw with J.D. Bickerstaff, whenever it was a close game and you needed to get subs in and out, and it was defensive guy, offensive guy, Isaac Okoro was always the first guy off the bench when it came to defensive if Dean Wade wasn't available. And he was also the first person coming to the bench when it was an offensive situation. So that's just where I'm sitting with it. And because I don't want to hate on Isaac. I think his work ethic speaks for itself, but you got to be realistic when it comes to these situations.
Yeah, I don't know that the Cavs would be comfortable at 15 or 16, honestly. I think mid-level exception is where they would be comfortable. And if it gets over that, if Isaac and his new representation says, nah, this is what we want, and it's, I'm trying to do the math really quick, and it's like 4 for 64 or something like that, or 4 for 60. It's 4 for 60, right? Hold on, let me do the math on that one. Divided by 4. Yeah, 4 for 60. I think the Cavs hope that he would play on the qualifying offer.
I mean, because 60 for 4 is 15.
That's the math that I had to do. I think that's too high for the Cavs.
I mean, I think it's interesting.
Especially because, they're about to make a huge financial commitment to Donovan Mitchell if he's willing to sign long-term. And they're about to make a huge financial commitment into the future to Evan Mobley. So, not everybody can make $15 million or north of $15 million. You know what I'm saying? You have to have a little bit more balance to that. And can the Cavs pay Isaac more than what they do Karis LeVert? I know it doesn't work that way, and there are different situations, but if you're talking about value and return on value and return on investment, can they pay him more than Max Strus?
No.
I don't think so. Max is a better player. Karis is a better player. So I think if that's what Isaac's people were asking for, I think the Cavs would balk at that.
Yeah.
They would say, okay, go find it on the market.
And then come back and talk to me when you don't. Because
that's exactly right.
I mean, 15 is good. Sure, I think they would ask him to do that, go find it somewhere else and come back because it's a restricted free agency. But if Sharif Cooper is listening to this podcast, we're not hating on your boy, man. We're just being real because I know you think your boy deserves a whole lot more. I remember reading tweets during the season about Isaac and Sharif talking about what they think he deserves throughout the season. And Sharif gonna vouch for his boy, especially coming from the same high school. But I don't know about that. But
at the time, Sharif's family member was representing Isaac too.
That's not a coincidence.
No, it's not.
But with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris and me by subscribing to Subtext. Sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy. But we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around. because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me and Chris. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.